The first sign will not be an explosion. It will not be a flash in the sky. It will be silence. A sudden, unnatural silence as the electrical heartbeat of modern civilization flatlines. Air conditioners stop mid-cycle. Traffic lights freeze. Cell towers go dark. In homes across entire regions, screens blink out and never come back. Refrigerators warm. Elevators stall. Water pumps cease. Within minutes, confusion spreads faster than information. Within hours, supply chains begin to fracture. Within days, the grid-down condition transforms from inconvenience into systemic failure. This is not fiction. This is the documented consequence of a large-scale electromagnetic pulse interacting with an unprotected electrical infrastructure. And the warning is simple. Most people misunderstand how EMP damage actually happens, and because of that misunderstanding, they are preparing for the wrong threat. An electromagnetic pulse, whether generated by a high-altitude nuclear detonation or an extreme solar geomagnetic disturbance, produces intense bursts of electromagnetic energy that couple into conductive materials. The mechanism is not mystical, it is physics. Rapidly changing electromagnetic fields induce currents in conductive paths. The longer and more exposed the conductor, the greater the induced voltage potential. Transmission lines spanning hundreds of miles become antennas. Distribution lines, household wiring, vehicle harnesses, circuit traces inside microelectronics, each becomes a pathway for energy that was never intended to be there. The danger is not the pulse itself as a flash. The danger is the induced overvoltage that overwhelms insulation tolerances, semiconductor junction thresholds, and transformer cores. When these components exceed design limits, they fail, sometimes instantly, sometimes cumulatively. The common misunderstanding is that an EMP fries everything electronic in a uniform blast. That image is inaccurate. The actual damage pattern depends on three components often described in technical literature as E1, E2, and E3. The E1 component is a fast, high-amplitude spike lasting nanoseconds, capable of damaging microelectronics. The E2 component resembles lightning and can be mitigated by systems already hardened against lightning surges. The E3 component is slower, lasting seconds to minutes, and behaves more like a geomagnetic storm, inducing large currents in long conductors, such as power lines and pipelines. Most civilian infrastructure is not comprehensively hardened against all three components simultaneously. Yet small, isolated electronics may survive if they are not connected to long conductive pathways at the moment of the event. This nuance is critical because it reshapes how practical shielding should be approached. Hidden within decades of electrical engineering research is a principle many overlook. Induced current requires both exposure and pathway. An electronic device sitting disconnected in a shielded enclosure behaves differently from a device plugged into a grid-spanning conductor. The grid itself is the amplifier. High-voltage transformers, especially extra-high-voltage units weighing hundreds of tons, are uniquely vulnerable to geomagnetically induced currents that drive them into core saturation. When saturated, they overheat, experience insulation breakdown, and can suffer irreversible damage. These transformers are not mass-produced consumer goods. Lead times for replacement under normal conditions can stretch from months to over a year. In a simultaneous nationwide failure, replacement becomes a logistical impossibility. That is where GridDown shifts from a localized outage to a prolonged systemic crisis. Evidence for this vulnerability is not speculative. Historical geomagnetic storms, such as the 1989 Hydro-Quebec blackout, demonstrated how solar activity can collapse large segments of power infrastructure within minutes. Research published by engineering institutions has repeatedly modeled the impact of high-altitude EMP scenarios on continental-scale grids. Controlled EMP testing on military systems has shown both susceptibility and survivability depending on shielding and grounding protocols. The science is not secret, it is technical, often buried in white papers, defense reports, and electrical standards documents that rarely reach public discussion. The overlooked reality is that infrastructure-level vulnerability does not automatically equal total device annihilation. Survival of personal electronics depends heavily on shielding effectiveness and isolation from long conductors. This leads to the survival implication that matters most. Grid failure is the central threat, not the destruction of every small device. If the grid collapses due to transformer damage and cascading protection trips, even undamaged devices become useless without power, communications backbone, and supply chain continuity. Refrigeration fails, fuel pumps stop, digital payment systems halt, and municipal water systems lose pressure once backup generators exhaust fuel. The cascading nature of infrastructure interdependence is what converts electrical disturbance into humanitarian emergency. Therefore, shielding strategy must prioritize not only preserving devices, but preserving functional capability in isolation from the grid. The escalation occurs when we consider time. The first 72 hours after a widespread blackout are defined by uncertainty. After that, supply chain stress begins to show. Modern logistics operate on just-in-time delivery. Warehouses hold limited buffer stock. Grocery stores rely on daily replenishment. Without electricity, distribution centers cannot operate conveyors or manage inventory systems. Fuel distribution relies on electric pumps and digital coordination. The absence of grid power radiates outward into transportation, healthcare, finance, and sanitation. This is not alarmism, it is systemic dependency mapped through emergency management studies. The grid is the keystone. Remove it, and structural integrity falters. The transition from vulnerability to preparation begins with understanding shielding physics at a practical level. Many people believe that simply placing electronics inside a metal box is sufficient. Sometimes it is, often it is not. Effective electromagnetic shielding requires continuous conductive enclosure, minimal gaps, proper bonding, and avoidance of internal conductive coupling that could transmit induced currents directly into the device. The concept commonly referred to as a Faraday cage is frequently misunderstood. A Faraday enclosure does not block electromagnetic energy in a mystical way. It redistributes charges along its conductive surface, preventing the interior from experiencing the same field intensity. However, this protection depends on enclosure integrity across relevant frequencies. Here is where hidden engineering detail becomes critical. The E1 component of an EMP contains very high frequency energy, meaning that even small seams or apertures can act as leakage points. The effectiveness of shielding is frequency dependent. A container with millimeter-scale gaps may attenuate lower frequency fields, but leak higher frequency spikes. Furthermore, if a device inside the enclosure touches the conductive wall, induced currents on the enclosure surface may couple directly into the device. Isolation within the shield is as important as the shield itself. Non-conductive padding and separation from enclosure walls prevent unintended conduction pathways. Laboratory measurements of shielding effectiveness demonstrate that common metal containers can provide significant attenuation if properly sealed. Ammunition cans, for example, have conductive bodies but may include rubber gaskets that interrupt electrical continuity across the lid seam. Without conductive bonding across that seam, shielding effectiveness decreases dramatically at higher frequencies. The solution is not complex, but it requires awareness, conductive tape, metallized gaskets, or removal of insulating coatings that prevent full contact. This is the kind of overlooked technical nuance that transforms a symbolic precaution into a functional one. Survival implications expand when we examine scale. Protecting a handheld radio, spare vehicle control module, solar charge controller, or small inverter may preserve critical post-event capability. Amateur radio operators who isolate backup transceivers and antennas disconnected from long feed lines increase the probability of maintaining local communication networks. Solar panels themselves are relatively robust, but charge controllers and inverters contain sensitive electronics that can fail under induced surges. Shielding spare units, disconnected and isolated, provides redundancy that can restore limited power generation even if grid infrastructure remains offline.
The escalation continues when we analyze vehicles. Modern vehicles incorporate numerous microcontrollers connected by wiring harnesses that span the vehicle chassis. These harnesses can act as partial antennas. However, testing has shown that not all vehicles fail under simulated EMP exposure. Susceptibility varies by design, shielding, and whether the engine is running at the time of exposure. A vehicle parked and powered down may experience less induced stress than one actively operating. This variability underscores a key point. Total loss is not guaranteed, but risk is real. Preserving spare critical modules inside effective shielding may be the difference between mobility and immobility during a prolonged grid-down scenario. Transitioning from device protection to infrastructure awareness, we must confront the reality that individual shielding does not restore a collapsed grid. National-level hardening requires transformer protection systems, surge arresters, neutral blocking devices, and coordinated grid segmentation strategies. Some measures have been implemented in various countries, particularly against geomagnetic disturbances. However, grid modernization is uneven. Aging infrastructure compounds vulnerability. Emergency management agencies plan for restoration